I used to tell myself it was just a dream, a terrible, vivid dream. But as the years passed, the details didn't fade like dreams usually do. They sharpened, became louder in my mind. Now, at 34, I can still smell the icy wind that crept through the cracks of our old house that morning. I can still hear Theo's excited bark as he bounded down the snow-dusted steps, and I can still see him sprawled in the yard, unmoving, red pooling beneath his soft golden fur. It was January 1st, 1994. I was 12. Our neighborhood, a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of Cleveland, was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. We knew everyone, and everyone knew us, or at least, we thought we did. My mom liked to say it was safe, a good place to raise kids, but after that morning, I began to notice the shadows between the streetlights, the muffled whispers of things we couldn't name. The man appeared out of nowhere. I'd taken Theo out early, just after sunrise, while my parents slept. The sky was a pale gray, the kind of color that makes the world feel muted. I was mid-yawn when I saw him standing at the edge of the yard. He wasn't threatening, at least not at first. He looked average, plain, the kind of face you forget as soon as you turn away. But there was something off. Theo froze, ears back, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I called his name, but he didn't budge. The man crouched, extending a hand toward him. His expression never changed, not friendly, not angry, just blank. And then, without warning, his other hand flashed forward, gripping something sharp. Theo yelped, a sound that ripped through the stillness, and collapsed. I stood there, frozen, as the man looked up at me. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. When I ran inside screaming for help, my parents didn't believe me. No one did. I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, they said. But I knew what I saw, and I would never forget. After Theo's death, the house felt smaller, stifling. My parents stopped talking about it almost immediately. He ran off, that's all, my mom would say whenever the subject came up, her tone clipped, her hands busy with whatever was in front of her. My dad didn't say anything at all, but I could see the strain in the way he slammed the cupboard doors or the way he stared at the evening news, beer in hand, as if trying to forget something he wouldn't admit. I wasn't allowed to bring it up anymore, not the man, not Theo, not the bloodstain on the snow. They told me I was mistaken, that I must have imagined it, but I knew better. I knew they didn't want to believe me. School wasn't any better. Kids can be cruel, especially when they sense weakness. Word spread fast that I'd freaked out about my dog. There was no mention of the man, of course. That part was mine alone, a secret I carried like a stone in my pocket, heavy, impossible to ignore. The teachers suggested counseling. It might help him process the loss. I overheard Mrs. Callahan whisper to my mom after class one day. Processing, apparently, involved sitting in a dim office with Dr. Myers while she asked me questions in a voice so soft it made my skin crawl. "How do you feel about what happened, Patrick?" I didn't answer. She didn't want to know how I really felt. That I didn't cry anymore, not because I wasn't sad, but because I was afraid. Afraid the man was still out there, waiting, watching. The days stretched on in a blur of sameness. The nights were worse. Every creak of the floorboards or groan of the old pipes sent my heart racing. I started sleeping with the blinds closed and my baseball bat by the bed, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of him. Always the same, his blank face, his empty eyes, the way he moved as if he didn't care who saw him. But it wasn't just a dream. It never was. Because then I started seeing him. In crowds. At the grocery store. across the street from the school. Just a flash of that face before it vanished, and no one else ever noticed. The first time I saw him again, I was sitting in a diner on a Saturday afternoon, watching rain streak across the windows. The familiar hum of conversation buzzed in the background, a comfort if I could still find such things. Then there he was, standing at the counter. It wasn't a perfect match for the man I'd seen the day Theo died. He was older, maybe, but the same presence, same stillness. His eyes never left mine, even though we weren't close. I knew it was him. My heart seized, my throat tightening like it was full of rocks. I could feel my hands starting to sweat. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stood up quickly, almost knocking my chair over. I had to leave. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think with him there. I fumbled for my wallet, hands shaking, and shoved a few bills onto the table before making a hasty exit. Outside, the rain hit me in sharp, cold bursts. The world felt so loud to loud. I looked back at the diner, expecting to see him watching from the window. Nothing. The diner was just as empty as it had been when I left. I walked home with my eyes fixed on the ground, my thoughts a blur of confusion and fear. Was I losing my mind? How could he be there? Why didn't anyone else see him? By the time I reached my front door, I was shaking, but the house was silent. Mom was still at work. Dad was already in his study. It was like nothing had changed. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat by the phone, waiting for something to happen. And then, as I sat there, waiting for a sound, I saw him again. His shadow flickered across the front yard, too quick for me to react. My heart skipped a beat, and I rose to my feet without thinking, rushing to the window. Empty. The street was dark. The shadows played tricks on me. But I knew better. The second time I saw him, I didn't run. I couldn't. It happened 2 weeks later. I was in the library, staring at a page in one of the books I used to love reading when I was a kid. The familiar scent of musty paper should have been comforting, but all I could think about was the man. The one whose face I couldn't describe, but whose presence lingered in the corners of my mind. I didn't know how I was supposed to act anymore. Every time I convinced myself I was losing my grip, the world seemed to unravel again. That day, I noticed someone at the edge of the aisle, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a worn brown jacket slightly too big for him. But his eyes, those were the ones I remembered. Not exactly the same, but they had the same piercing coldness. I turned away quickly, trying to act normal, but my hand was shaking so much I dropped the book I was holding. When I bent down to pick it up, I noticed something that almost made me faint. A piece of paper tucked under the book. I opened it. You can't escape. I glanced around, but no one was close. I felt my breath quicken. The man was still there, his eyes fixed on me, not moving, just watching. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to trust anymore. The shadows fell deeper now, and the walls in my own home seemed to close in. Later that night, I tried calling my old friend Sarah, but she didn't answer. We hadn't talked much in the past few years, but she was the one person who always made me feel like maybe there was still something good in the world. Maybe I could get her to believe me. But when I left her a voicemail, I realized something. I was starting to doubt myself. The man, the messages, the terror, it was all connected, but I couldn't see the pattern. Couldn't see the whole picture. All I had were these pieces that didn't fit together, no matter how hard I tried to force them. And now, the most terrifying part. I was starting to think I was the one who was wrong. I had to know. That thought consumed me like a fire. There was no more ignoring it, No more pretending that everything would just go away on its own. I couldn't keep living with this constant weight pressing down on me, a presence I couldn't escape. I had to face it, whatever it was. The night I decided to confront him, I went to the place I feared the most, the alley behind the old diner on 6th Street. It was dark, and the air had that biting cold that always made the back of my neck prickle. The alley had always felt wrong, like it held secrets no one was meant to know. But tonight, I needed answers. I walked slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Every step felt like it was echoing in the still night air. I could barely see in the dim light, but I knew I was close. I knew he would be here. I wasn't wrong. The man was there, leaning against the brick wall, as though waiting for me. His face was still blank, but there was something in his stance, something cold, predatory. The same eyes, the same feeling that gnawed at me from the inside out. "You've been looking for me," he said. His voice was low, almost too soft to hear over the sound of my pulse in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Not now. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, studying me. "I'm the one you can't outrun, the one you've been searching for, whether you want to or not." I took a step back, a wave of nausea hitting me. "What do you want from me?" His lips twitched, almost into a smile. "I don't want anything. You've already given it to me. All of it I didn't understand. I couldn't understand." I wanted to shout at him, demand answers, but my mind was spiraling out of control. There was something wrong, something far beyond my comprehension. And then, in that moment, I saw it, the truth, staring me in the face. I knew him, not from some distant memory, not from a dream, but from something darker, deeper. I had seen him before, but it wasn't in any way that made sense. The pieces were falling together too quickly, and I wasn't ready for it. He took a step toward me, closing the distance between us, and for the first time, I could hear his breath, slow and deliberate. "You know me now," he said, "and you know what's coming next." The air was thick with something I couldn't name, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was heavier, like the ground beneath me was no longer solid, but shifting, pulling me into something I didn't understand. I stumbled back, barely catching myself against the dumpster, my head spinning. What had just happened? How had I known him? But the truth hit harder than any blow could have. I had known him all along. He was the shadow in my childhood, the figure in my nightmares. But he was also real. I looked at him, and for a second, I saw it all. The face I couldn't place, the memories I couldn't touch, now came rushing back. The man had been part of my life in ways I never understood, and the reality of that was suffocating. "You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you?" I asked, my voice a fractured whisper. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence like a pressure, suffocating everything around me. His cold eyes locked onto mine, and there was no doubt anymore this wasn't just some fleeting delusion. This was something far worse. "You've always been a part of it," he said, his voice colder now, like the chill of a forgotten grave. "You thought you could outrun it, but you never could." I closed my eyes, trying to block him out, but the words echoed in my skull. I had never been free of this. It hit me then, the lives that had been shattered, the friends lost in the aftermath of my silence, my inaction. David, Theo. They were all pieces of a puzzle I had been too terrified to solve. But no more. I opened my eyes and took a step toward him, even though every part of me screamed to run. "What do you want from me?" The man's lips curled upward in a twisted semblance of a smile, and his eyes gleamed with something I couldn't quite place. "Nothing," he said, voice like ice. You've given me everything already. I couldn't breathe. His words rang in my ears, and the world around me blurred, becoming less tangible, more unreal. I tried to walk away, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place. It was like he had control over everything. Over me. Then, out of nowhere, a voice broke through. "Patrick, what the hell are you doing here?" I turned quickly, surprised, almost relieved to see anyone else. It was Jamie, my old friend from high school, the one I hadn't spoken to in years. Her eyes widened when she saw who I was facing. "You," she gasped, taking a step back. "What the hell is he doing here?" But the man didn't react. He simply stood there, watching, almost as though he knew Jamie would be the next to break. Jamie turned to me. "Patrick, are you okay?" I shook my head. "No," the man's smile widened. I could hear Jamie's voice, distant, calling my name, but it was drowned out by the pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't look away from him. "Not now. You have to get out of here," I whispered to Jamie, my voice barely a breath. She wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to know. But the man, the one who haunted me, had made sure of it. He'd made sure that everyone I cared about would be dragged into this nightmare. He was still watching. His eyes never left me. "Patrick," Jamie reached for me, but something in my gut told me not to let her get any closer. "Not now, not while he was here." "I'll handle this," I muttered, trying to steady my voice, to keep it from shaking. I had to. I couldn't let this go on. "You need to go." Now, for a moment, she hesitated. I could see the doubt in her eyes, the uncertainty. But there was something else there to fear, the same kind I had seen in myself. Finally, she nodded. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Jamie was smart enough to know when things were beyond our control. I watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the darkness. And then I turned back to him. He was still standing there, unmoving, silent. "What do you want from me?" I said, this time with more force. "What do you want me to do? Just say it. Say what this is. What's the point of all this?" The man's lips twitched into that unsettling smile again. "You think it's that simple?" His voice was almost playful now, like he was enjoying this. "You've known what this is. You've always known. The only question is whether or not you'll embrace it." The weight of his words hit me harder than anything before. "Embrace it?" I repeated, confused, my mind spinning. He nodded. "You've been running your whole life, Patrick. Running from the truth, from who you really are, from what you're meant to become. But you can't run forever. The truth. What truth? What was he talking about? "I'm not like you," I said, my voice shaking with anger now, though I wasn't sure where it came from. "I'm nothing like you." "Oh, but you are," he replied, stepping closer, his shadow swallowing the space between us. "You're just too blind to see it yet." He was close enough now that I could feel the chill of his presence on my skin, and with it, a realization hit me. I wasn't going to get answers from him. Not now, not ever. I had to find them myself. I stood taller, fighting against the trembling in my hands, the flood of memories crashing into me. I had spent years running from this, from him, but I didn't have to anymore. I didn't have to let him control me. This was my life, my choice. "No," I said, taking a step back. "No more. I'm done." His eyes flickered with something that almost resembled disappointment, but I didn't wait for him to speak. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the shadows, the echoes of his words hanging in the air behind me. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had taken the first step. For the first time in a long time, I was choosing to fight. I thought I could outrun it. I thought walking away from him would be enough. But now, standing in the hallway of my apartment, I felt the weight of his words crash down on me. The room seemed smaller, suffocating. The air, once familiar, felt charged with something I couldn't escape. I leaned against the wall, my head swimming with the details I hadn't yet processed: the man's cryptic remarks, Jamie's fear, the growing certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. But I didn't know how. How could I confront something like that? Something I had spent years trying to forget? The mirror in front of me cracked. Not physically. It was the reflection fractured, out of focus. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw his face staring back at me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I was losing control. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't do this alone anymore. It had always been easier to ignore, to pretend I could live a normal life. But the longer I waited, the deeper it sunk in. The man wasn't just a memory, a figment of my past. He was here now, and he was relentless. I grabbed my phone, dialing the only number I could think of. Jamie. She needed to know everything. All of it. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Patrick, Jamie," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's real anymore. But I need you to listen to me. You have to trust me." She was silent on the other end. I could hear the hesitation in her breath, the conflict inside her. But there was also something else, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "I'm listening," she said. "Tell me." I took a deep breath and told her everything. The man, the memories, the feeling of being hunted even now, the way his presence made my skin crawl, and the certainty that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. When I finished, there was a long pause. I could almost feel her processing, trying to make sense of the madness. Finally, she spoke. "We need to get to the bottom of this. You're not alone, Patrick. We'll figure this out together." I clenched the phone in my hand, a wave of relief washing over me. "We're not running anymore," I said. "I'm done with that. It wasn't enough. I knew that. We needed a plan." But for the first time, I wasn't completely alone in this fight. And that made all the difference. The door to Jamie's apartment creaked as it opened, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else. I couldn't place something unsettling, like the remnants of something I shouldn't have seen. Jamie was already there, her face pale under the harsh light. She had been going through old boxes, documents, anything that might explain the strange series of events. But there was no comfort in knowledge, not when I felt it closing in again. "Patrick," she whispered, her voice tight. "I found something." I walked over slowly, each step feeling heavier, like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't control. Jamie handed me a small, tattered journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. It was familiar to familiar. I opened it, and there, written in a scrawl that made my stomach churn, was a name I hadn't seen in years: Theo. My breath caught. "This was his," Jamie said, nodding toward the journal. "I think this might have been the man's, whoever he is." I scanned the page. The handwriting seemed to distort as I read it, as if the ink itself were trying to pull me under. But there was no mistaking the meaning of the words: an obsession with me, a promise to return, the same message repeating in different forms. "You don't know what he wants," Jamie said. "But we do know he's been following you your whole life." I felt the blood drain from my face. The truth I had tried to bury was clawing its way to the surface. The lights flickered. It wasn't the storm. I looked up. Jamie was staring at something behind me, something I didn't dare turn to face. "Patrick," she whispered, trembling. "Look." I turned slowly, my muscles locking as I did. There, standing in the doorway, was the man. But not just his figure, his face was now clear, impossibly so. I knew it immediately. It was the same face that had haunted my dreams, the same face from the news reports, the one that shouldn't exist. "Why?" I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Because you're mine." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, all at once, he lunged. I barely had time to react. Jamie screamed. I grabbed the nearest object, something heavy, and swung it at him. The impact made him stumble back, but those eyes locked onto mine with a kind of certainty that chilled me to the bone. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice an echo, like it came from every corner of the room at once. "You never could." In that moment, I understood. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything: the past, the terror that had been building all this time, the broken pieces I had tried to ignore. The man wasn't just a killer, a ghost. He was a part of something much darker, something that was coming for all of us. And I didn't know if I could stop it. The room felt suffocating as the man closed the distance, his steps slow but deliberate. I backed into the corner, my mind racing, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. "Jamie, get out!" I yelled, but she was frozen, her eyes wide with terror, her body stiff. She couldn't move. It wasn't her fault, not really. This thing, whatever it was, had been following me for so long. I couldn't remember a time before it. Before him. I swung again, desperate, the makeshift weapon barely grazing his arm. The man didn't flinch. Instead, his lips curled into a smile, too wide, too knowing. "You don't understand, Patrick," he said, his voice low and suffocating. "This isn't about you fighting. It's about you accepting." His words were like daggers, piercing through my mind, unraveling something deep inside of me. I felt the walls close in, the air thick with something far worse than fear. "Accept what?" I choked out, my voice hoarse. He took another step closer, his smile widening until it felt like it could swallow me whole. "That you're already mine." The world seemed to tilt, the room distorting around me as I struggled to hold on to reality. My vision blurred, my senses warping. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, unable to speak. The man was gone. The apartment, the sounds, the overwhelming fear, it all felt distant. Jamie was still there, though. She was crying, her face wet with tears, but her eyes, they looked lost, like she was no longer seeing me. It wasn't until later, when I found the photo, that I understood. The same photo, the one from my childhood, the one I had tried so hard to forget. But this time, something was different. The man wasn't just in the background. He was standing right behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. I should have known. It was never over. The man would always be watching, waiting, and I would always be the one running. It's been years. I've moved to another city, tried to forget, but the memories won't fade. The man is still out there, following me in ways I can't explain. Sometimes I wonder if he's real or if he's just the manifestation of something darker, something I can never escape. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop running. Not as long as he's watching.